Our guest tonight is WWE Hall of Famer and wrestling legend J.J. Dillon. How you doing?
Fine. How are you guys doing?
Oh, we're very excited to have you on the show, sir. Very excited. Listen, when most fans hear the name J.J. Dillon, they immediately think of the Four Horsemen. I know the stable was originally thrown together on TV, and it just happened to click the right way. But when did you know the group was really doing something special? And are there any moments that stick out from that time period as your most favorite?
Well, I can't really pinpoint with the exact moment because, as you has already said, it was a spontaneous thing, and we were running a pretty hectic schedule at that time. The Horsemen were, yet to be, but we were still wrestling, 6 nights a week, 7 nights a week, and we were doing TV on Saturday mornings at TBS, and then going somewhere to appear that night, and often Sunday was a matinee and an evening shot. So it was a pretty hectic schedule, and the TV in Atlanta was normally a 2-hour thing that came on at 6:05 that we would record in the morning, and it was like live to tape. It wasn't done in segments. They rolled, and whatever you got is what you got, and maybe that was some of the appeal of it. But when you're doing a 2-hour show like that, and a lot of times we would be out late the night before and get to the studio in Atlanta, and in all honesty, maybe not be 100%. And sometimes the best results and the best material comes out of that environment. And it was a situation where Flair was world champion. Ole and Arn were world tag champions. Tully was national champion. I was actually only managing Tully, and we had some extra time, and somebody said, everybody that's the champions, take your belts and go out there as a group. And I went with him because I was managing Tully, and it was Arn that, made the comment. People at home look at your screen because never have so few wreak so much havoc on everybody else. You'd have to go back to the history of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and he held up four fingers. And nobody really gave it a thought, except anytime any of us went out after that, and it started in the studio, and then it kind of went into the arenas when we appeared live, that the people were yelling Four Horsemen, and I think part of the appeal too was it was an interactive thing with the fans, because all of a sudden, they were involved. And probably, to answer your questions, it might have been, it might have been a week or two before we realized that this thing was catching on, because everywhere we went, it was the same story.
Mike Chiari?
The Four Horsemen is the most iconic group in the history of professional wrestling, in my opinion. But it's interesting in that it had several different incarnations over the years, with a bunch of different members getting involved at one point or another. In your opinion, what was the best version of the Four Horsemen, and what do you think put it over the top in comparison to the other versions?
Well, I'm often asked that question, and the history of wrestling is that anytime anything catches on and is successful, promoters by their very nature are going to ride it past its peak and ride it till the horse has no energy left and drops. So no one should be surprised that there were a number of incarnations of the Four Horsemen, even after what I would call the glory years. But the original group with Ole will always be special to me, because everybody that was part of that group was already established. It wasn't like someone trying to get a rub from somebody else to elevate somebody. I mean, everybody was already there. Everybody was a champion, had the bragging rights. That was part of the initial appeal. And I always think that the original group with Ole, if it hadn't been for him, it's kind of like maybe none of the other things then would have followed. But certainly of that group, Flair was kind of the foundation, with the limousine driving, jet flying, kiss stealing son of a gun. And if you look at everybody, I was a little bit older, but I could, I could kind of fall into that groove. Certainly, Tully fancied himself a ladies' man, and Arn was young, and Ole was the one that stuck out as being, geez, he just doesn't seem to fit that mold, because Ole was late in his career and often referred to as a grumpy old man. So it made it easy to move Ole out of the picture, which accomplished two things after we had a initial successful run, because Ole drew money no matter where he wrestled, and his style never changed, and no matter what side of the ring he was on, you got the same match. So it kind of freshened us up, because now we had a personal issue with somebody that was a part of us that now was across the ring from us, and that opened a spot for Luger, who was not experienced. He was really, really green, and became available because of a situation he got in Florida with Bruiser Brody, and had to leave. And I think Eddie Graham and probably Jimmy Crockett had talked, and they said, well, this guy's got a great body, and we could kind of move him in because these guys are really established, and we could camouflage the fact that Lex wasn't experienced and polished. But then I moved past that to when Barry Windham shocked the wrestling world and jumped sides and joined us. I really believe that in terms of bell-to-bell action, the group with Barry was probably the greatest in terms of what we could accomplish in the ring on any given night. And then once Tully and Arn left to go to New York to join Bobby the Brain Heenan as the Brainbusters, as far as I was concerned, the glory years of the Horsemen was over. They were never going to be as big as they were during that extended run. So Ole will be always special. I look at Barry Windham as the group that bell to bell technically probably was the best. And then beyond that, I really don't think that much about it.
Brandon Gavin?
Everybody has their own style for cutting promos, but what do you feel is the most effective way to connect with an audience?
Well, everybody, if you look at the history of the wrestling business, the successful managers, certainly Bobby the Brain Heenan, who I always look to as being the greatest of all time. And Bobby had his style. He was a great in-ring performer. He was very quick and witty. Cornette was more over the top with a tennis racket, and certainly didn't demonstrate any wrestling ability. That wasn't part of him. Playboy Gary Hart could do it all. He's a guy that I think that gets lost in the shuffle and never gets his due in terms of recognition of how really great he was. But you look at Jimmy Hart and you look at Lou Albano and a lot of the other managers. There was not a great similarity in all of them. Each was an individual that had their own personality, their own way of going about doing things. And for me, a lot of people, they think of me as the leader of the Four Horsemen, which was really just a snapshot of my career. And most people, unless you're a student of the business, don't know that I had over 3,200 wrestling matches over a 20-year period. So I wrestled full-time 5 years and was a referee for the first 8 years before that. So I had a wealth of experience. I think being a referee, when I finally got a chance to put on the tights, which was my lifelong dream, it enabled me to be a better wrestler, and the wrestling experience then enabled me to be a better manager. And my philosophy was always less is more. I didn't have to be out there drawing attention. If there was a close parallel to me, I would say Paul Ellering, that carried the rolled-up newspaper and talked about managing the affairs of the Road Warriors. And I kind of treated my role as almost like a legitimate general manager of a unique group of athletes. So, again, less is more work for me.
The biggest news recently, unfortunately, was the passing of Roddy Piper. As someone who spent the majority of their life in and around the wrestling industry, how do you view Piper's impact on the business, and what are your thoughts on his career as a whole?
Well, I knew Roddy for over 40 years. I started in the business full-time in the Carolinas with Jim Crockett Sr. And I was not a kid. I was 28 years old, actually months from my 29th birthday when I started full time. And I stayed there for over 2 years, and from there I got my first break in the business in the Canadian Maritimes, which just ran during the summer months in the hockey arenas when they didn't have the ice down. And I went up there and got my first, big push. And I would work on TV. They would do TV one day a week. And one of my TV matches was a relatively young, inexperienced wrestler that had only been around the business a year or two, and his name was Roddy Piper. And I beat him up on TV, and that was the only time in my whole career that I ever faced Roddy Piper. But that was 1973, and it was the beginning of a relationship that lasted over 40 years. So I have been very close to Roddy over that period of time. And Roddy, when you look at him physically, he was certainly not a physical monster. So it wasn't like his size or anything like that stood out, even though he was a legitimate tough guy. He was a Canadian Golden Gloves champion as a boxer before he started wrestling, wrestled, and then also studied judo and was a black belt in judo. So Roddy, in spite of his size, never backed down from a challenge with anybody. And I've often said that fear was not a word in his vocabulary. So I had a chance to see Roddy many, many times over the years, to be around him, and as over the top as he could be, he was an innovator. And he always, here's a guy that was in the first WrestleMania. He could go on TV with Gordon Soley weekly for a period of time as co-commentator on Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS and do an excellent job. And yet when he did the Piper's Pit thing and broke the coconut over the head of Jimmy Snuka, they still talk about things like that today. So Roddy just was off the wall. You never knew what he was going to do. And the word icon and the word legend gets thrown around a lot in our business. But we've lost two people in the period of less than a 2-month period of time that, for me, who spent half of my life, half a century, in and around the wrestling business, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, and Roddy Piper, to me, exemplify what is really, truly an iconic legend. And both of them are going to be very much missed. I care deeply about both of them. They were friends as well as people that I work with. And I don't think there'll be another American Dream, and I don't think there'll be another Roddy Piper. There will never be somebody come along blessed with that kind of talent that will achieve what they achieved and have the impact on the business that they had.
Mike Chiari?
Well, you're probably best known for your role in the Four Horsemen, but you also did a lot of behind-the-scenes work with WWF, including being a key member of talent relations. And I assume there were a lot of big decisions that you made that kind of helped shape the course of WWF moving forward. So for you, what do you consider to be your biggest success in that role with WWF? And also, what do you think your biggest shortcoming was?
Well, my biggest success was that I was able to fit in, and I lasted there a period of almost 8 years. And Vince McMahon, was often vilified by traditional wrestling fans, for where he's taken the business. And I have to say, I'm a product of the regional territories, of which there were 25, and I worked around some of the greatest minds in the business, from the Funks to Fritz von Erich to the Sheik to Eddie Graham was the one that I think had the greatest impact on my career. I look at him as my mentor, and he also influenced Dusty and Bill Watts and some of the other great successful minds in the business, and Gary Hart. So, I, like I said, started late, The Horsemen had kind of run its course. Tully and Arn had left to go to New York. Crockett was still getting great numbers on TBS, but I think they grew so big so fast that they really didn't have the infrastructure to deal with it from a business standpoint, and that ended up a situation where Ted Turner, who always wanted to be a promoter and own a promotion, stepped in, and TBS bought Crockett Promotions to protect the the television show and the television ratings. And there was a lot of things that I saw that, because here you had basically a broadcast company that just had wrestling as one of their divisions. There wasn't the passion that I was accustomed to with a lot of the old-time wrestlers that like Eddie Graham and Fritz Von Erich and the Sheik. They didn't all have to be ex-wrestlers. Certainly, Jim Crockett Sr. Never wrestled, but many of the successful ones had former wrestling careers. Vern Gagne, Bill Watts. So I went up there, or was given an opportunity. I got a phone call right after the buyout, and I had some concerns over the direction of the new company. And my contract had expired. I was basically a free agent, even though nobody was aware of it at that time. And I got a call from Tully saying that Vince and Pat Patterson are, doing all the matchmaking, all the TV, and they had 3 tours a night. And of course, that's back when only had 5 major pay-per-views. And they said they needed help, and some people had said some positive things about me. And I was interested to make a call, and I called an old friend, Terry Garvin, who put Pat Patterson on the phone, who I'd only met one time, and it resulted in me going to New York around the holidays, and Vince McMahon sent a limo in to get me, and I went up to his home, and eventually that's how I went to work for him, with the understanding that I was walking off camera. And at that point, I really wasn't giving up a lot. I was probably 44 and having a lot of special attraction matches against Paul Ellering, which how many of them can you have for how long? So timing-wise, it was good. And I looked at it as a referee. I had known Vince McMahon Sr., who used to come to the big shows in Philadelphia, and knew him by name, or he knew me by name, I should say. And now here's Vince at that point. They had already had WrestleMania 3 or 4, I want to say. And here's his son basically sending an overture for me to go to work there based on my creative ability, my attention to detail. And that's what happened. I went up there and went to work. So in terms of my greatest accomplishment, make no mistake about it, Vince has the final say on everything. You express opinions. You're asked how you feel about certain things, and the nature of the business is that if it was easy and anybody could do it, then the business everybody would make a fortune that ever got into wrestling. But it's not that way. It's as simplistic as it is with somebody who's the fans like against somebody who the fans dislike, and the two face each other, and how complicated could that be? But it's basically an episodic soap opera that takes place weekly on television that never ends. It's not seasonal like baseball or football or basketball, and there's a certain science to being able, especially back when pay-per-view was such a big source of revenue, to be able to keep ratings up, keep interest up, and yet be able to have some things that are super attractions for when you have a pay-per-view. So I think my greatest accomplishment was the fact that I fit in, because a lot of people, Vince is not comfortable, I think, working with a lot of people. And I've found that over the years, and he found a comfort level with me, which was fortunate for me. And I loved working with Pat Patterson, who was one of the really true great minds in the business. And it was a period of success for the predecessor to what is now the public company with the WWE. And shortcomings, I don't know. I don't know. I love the business. I started as a fan as a kid in New Jersey when I was a teenager, and I've got 2 Hall of Fame rings, and I've received a lot of accolades over the years. But I'm still a fan, and I still love the business. I could never be a Vince McMahon. If you want to say, okay, well, where's your greatest weakness? And I worked very closely with Dusty. And Dusty was a big picture guy who had visions, and my best attribute was detail, attention to detail. So I could take this big picture that Dusty had and then fill in the cracks, and I think I complimented him well. But if I had a weakness, my maybe weakness was that I wasn't a Vince McMahon. I wasn't a Dusty Rhodes in terms of the ability to see and envision that big picture.
Brandon Gavin?
Well, you spoke earlier about the influence that Dusty and Piper had on the business, but who is the most influential person for you in the wrestling business?
Oh, there have been so many. I started in the Northeast, and back in those days, each area produced their own television, and when I grew up, it was kind of the land of the monsters. When I first watched TV, it was Argentina Rocca and Carl Von Hess and Dr. Jerry Graham, and it was Professor Roy Shire initially, and then Eddie Graham, Chief Big Heart, Haystacks Calhoun, Bobo Brazil, The Sheik, these bigger than life characters, and that's what attracted me. I fell in love with it and just decided at a very young age that that's what I wanted to do. But to me, I had and this is before these developmental territories or the wrestling schools that you hear about or training facilities. There was nothing like that back in those days. In fact, if anything, the old timers in the business kind of discouraged young guys who expressed an interest and wanted to get into wrestling because they looked at you as a threat to somebody. If they helped you, might come in and take their place. So it wasn't easy getting into the business, but I was around a long time. I had I guess my passion for the business came through. I was fortunate to be in the era where Bruno Sammartino defeated Buddy Rogers and started that incredible run as a champion where he was, selling out Madison Square Garden every third week. And to me, Bruno has been a personal friend for over 50 years. And every time I get into a debate, who's the greatest champion of all time, it's like, well, I met Lou Thesz but never saw Lou Thesz wrestle. But, a lot of the old timers will say Lou Thesz was the greatest of all time. I saw Bruno, and I was the third man in the ring for a lot of his epic matches. And if I learned the business anywhere, I think I learned more there being in the ring as the third man. And, of course, being around Flair all those years, being around Hulk Hogan when I first went to work for Vince McMahon. There have been so many great champions. Dory Funk Jr. was the NWA World Champion when I went to Charlotte. I didn't even know what the NWA was. I had heard of Lou Thesz and traced the lineage back. Gene Kiniski but Dory Funk was the world champion for a 4-year period of time, and that's unheard of today. To think that one individual would travel around all over the world, all over the country, defending the title, and remain champion for 4 years and not have the people lose interest. But it was a different era. The championship belt definitely meant something. It meant something to the fans, and those of us that were in the business as wrestlers meant something as well. We looked up to the champions. We looked up at Dory Funk, at Harley Race, at Jack Briscoe, and Dusty Rhodes, and you can just go right down the line. All of the great champions were special because they were on a higher plateau, and where each of us dreamed that someday we had the ability to hopefully to get there or get as close as possible. So it's really difficult. It's impossible for me to single out, who was the greatest. One of the guys that caught my attention when I was very young and really not fully understanding all of the aspects of the business, I had a fan club for Johnny Valentine, and there was something special about him. He wasn't a guy that went in and bulldozed people, and he didn't have a flamboyant air about him or costumes, but he would get more accomplished with just a look and a glance. And one of the things that he was attributed to saying, and I believe it, having watched him, was, nothing I can ever say is going to convince you or anybody else that wrestling is real, but I can sure convince you that Johnny Valentine is real. And just like Oahu McDaniel, they would take a guy and drape him over that top rope and hit him with a forearm smash that sweat would fly and the welts would come up and sometimes blood blisters. And he boy, if I had to pick out somebody just immediately to mention a name, Johnny Valentine would be very high on that list. And a lot of the guys in the business, when asked the same question, you'll hear Johnny Valentine's name mentioned a lot.
Well, we mentioned losing Roddy Piper, and also we mentioned Dusty Rhodes. You had a long history with the American Dream in and out of the ring. How would you describe Dusty's legacy in the wrestling industry, and do you think he made a bigger impact in the ring or behind the scenes?
I think he did both. He basically took Crockett Promotions to another level. That they were a regional company based out of Charlotte, a family-owned business, and Dusty came in there, and I was fortunate enough to join him right at the beginning. And certainly the pinnacle of my career was that run with the Horsemen, and as successful as we were, and I've said this before too, the people wouldn't buy tickets just to see the Horsemen come out and stand in the corner. There had to be somebody on the opposite side, and when the bell rang, there had to be something that they wanted to buy a ticket to see. And basically, Dusty was the catalyst across the ring, and was surrounded by the Road Warriors and Magnum TA before his tragic accident, and Ronnie Garvin and Jimmy Valiant, and just a lot of great talent that was in the business at that time. And it just was a chemistry with all of those people that made it successful. And Dusty was a big part of it, because he was the driving force. The War Games, that was Dusty's brainchild. The Great American Bash, of going outdoors to ballparks where we drew crowds that were in excess of any of the buildings that we were going to. So Dusty was an innovator. And in terms of his in-ring persona, he just was a great talent. And it wasn't like he just was big in Florida or just big in the Carolinas. Dusty was a headliner in Madison Square Garden. Everywhere he went, he was a main eventer. So when I say that I look at the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, and Roddy Piper as being iconic legends, that's a definition that I reserve for very few, and we've lost two of the greatest in a very, very short period of time, and it's sad. They're gone forever, and they were both friends.
Well, I'm tired of being somber. Let's stop being somber. Everybody's got a funny Dusty Rhodes story. What can you just give us? Let's lighten it up a little bit. What's the best Dusty Rhodes story you got?
God, I don't know if anybody. I had a relationship with Dusty, and I was very close with his family. I watched his sons grow up, but Dusty and I actually. One thing that we shared in common is we're both very private people, and I am, and Dusty was too. And we did a live roundtable a couple weeks ago in Chicago that aired on the WWE network. It was really a well done piece. It was Jerry Lawler monitored it, and Flair was there, Arn was there, I was there, and Michael Hayes, who was around Dusty a lot down with the Bill Watts territory. And Arn told a story that I had never heard before that to me was the funniest Dusty story, even though it didn't directly involve me. And, you know, we each had separate dressing rooms. That was always kind of how it was back in the old days. And I don't know what the circumstances were, why Arn went to the opposite dressing room, whether it was early in the evening before people were in the building or what he was doing there. But when he walked in, you know, he was basically a fish out of water because this was not where he would normally be. And there was Dusty. I don't know if he had to ask Dusty something, but there was Dusty with that typical cutoff T-shirt that he always wore, a pair of boots, a cap, and nothing else. He was naked from the waist down. And Arn said, I looked at him, and he said, Dusty's walking around the dressing room like this, and apparently that was his normal M.O. He just walked around with that cutoff T-shirt, a cap, and his boots, and nothing else. And Arn said, I was trying to take care of whatever it was I was supposed to ask him, and I was kind of having trouble even remembering what it was because I was trying not to stare or be obvious that I wasn't staring. And the more Arn went on telling the story, the funnier it got. So to me, that's the funniest story that I've ever heard about Dusty, and it actually involved Arn and Dusty and didn't directly involve me.
Mike Yari?
Well, a lot of wrestlers kind of jump between WWF and WCW during the Monday Night Wars. But you were unique in that you worked mostly backstage, in addition to the on-screen authoritative role you had in WCW. So having been in the trenches with both companies, what were the biggest differences between them during that time period? And what do you believe ultimately put WWF over the top?
Well, I, as I said, worked for some of the greatest minds, and because I started late in the business, I was like a sponge in terms of knowing that Father Time was not on my side, that if I wanted to have longevity in the business that I love so much, you know, I was going to have to become more informed and knowledgeable about matchmaking, about television production, management of talent, the you know, how talents were routed, the travel aspect of it, et cetera, et cetera. So even when I first started, every territory that I went to, even when I was just wrestling, I got involved with wanting to know more of the behind-the-scenes details. You know, some guys would go to the arena and all they wanted to know about was their match and didn't worry about anything else. And I wanted to learn the whole picture. And what it did was it gave me longevity in the business. The other thing that it did was when it came time to dealing with talent, I had the advantage of having walked a mile in the shoes of the guys that I was having to deal with. So one example was once contracts became the norm in the business, most of them, until later on when there were more high-dollar guarantees, most of them just gave an opportunity because the logic was that the wrestling promotion is established, we have a time slot, we have an audience, and you as a talent come in, and now we're going to give you a chance to be part of that program, get exposure, and it's an investment in your career, and what you do with it really is in part, a big part yours with some help of what I see in you and us working together. So I, in all the smaller territories, used to wear 10 hats. I would be involved with the travel and other aspects. And when I went to work for what was then the WWF before they went public, I all of a sudden found that here's this huge company, and there were 10 full-time professionals doing what I used to do on a much smaller scale, doing the job, all 10 jobs myself. And they weren't necessarily all huge wrestling fans either, but each was a specialist or an expert in their field. And the whole operation was on a much, much larger scale than anything that I had seen anywhere else. And the other thing that was eye-opening was the fact that Vince McMahon was hands-on with every single aspect, and he would be in the office, as I would too, with a jacket and tie on Monday through Friday. And if there was a poster for an upcoming pay-per-view or a release of a DVD or something, and there's Hulk in the ring, tearing the shirt or something, the attention to detail was phenomenal. If you ever took a picture of somebody in the ring with the audience behind you, I can almost guarantee you that you're never, ever going to find a situation where every seat is filled. There's somebody that's either going to the bathroom or went to get popcorn, and there's going to be empty seats. But when you would look at that poster, every seat was filled in, because if it wasn't, they filled it in. This is back when they talk about photoshopping and airbrushing and whatever. Hulk was made to look the absolute best that he could look, and Vince McMahon was hands-on in every aspect of the business, and all of the creative was done on the weekends, in the comfort of his home, dressed casually. And Pat and I would be at Vince's home on a Saturday all day, to the point of exhaustion. And most of those nights, we would sit at the dinner table with his family, and sometimes work late into the evening and come back Sunday and do it again, depending on what the urgency was, if a TV or something major was coming up. So Vince, though I had times when I had frustrations with him, because Vince didn't believe in anybody taking a vacation. And to me, I thought, vacation could be a healthy thing. You get away sometimes and you get a break from whatever it is. It doesn't mean that you don't have the passion anymore. It's just a chance to get away, to clear your head, and sometimes you come back and see things with a fresh perspective. Vince was 24/7, 365 days a year. He would have a notepad and a pen by his bed at night, and if he would wake up and think of something, he would jot it down for fear that come morning, it would skip his mind. So Vince has had his critics. There have been times where I was not in agreement with a lot of the things or the directions that he's taken, but the other side of the coin is that you can't argue with success. He's built basically a global empire, and it truly is global. They talk about the WWE universe, and now he's taken another major step with eliminating traditional pay-per-view with this network, and it's a work in progress. And we're going to have to wait to see how that plays out. But if there's one person who can make it work, it is Vince McMahon, because he's tireless, he's demanding, and at TBS, you didn't have that powerful figure that was a third and now fourth generation person whose whole life was centered around an understanding of the wrestling business. And that was what eventually led to the demise of WCW, because you had all of these people who were at the North Tower at the CNN Center, who handled all these different divisions of a broadcast company, but none of them knew anything about wrestling. In fact, most of them kind of looked their nose down at it and would have been just as happy if wrestling had not been one of the products. But the person who loved wrestling was Ted Turner, because when he started the UHF station, Channel 17, and made the Superstation, it wasn't on very many clearances, but the three things were the Andy Griffith Show, the Atlanta Braves, who were drawing horrible at that time. You could let a shotgun off out in the outfield and not worry about hitting anybody. And the third thing was wrestling. And if you asked Ted, to give them tea and order, wrestling was number one for him. And he always had a passion for it. He protected it. And that was one of the sad things when it came to an end, because not only were there 70-some guys who earned a living full-time from the wrestling business, that actually was a pool of talent from which Vince could eventually draw from. And you could use as examples The Undertaker, Chris Jericho, Mick Foley, Steve Austin. All these guys, came through WCW, but it was Vince that took them and made what he refers to as superstars in the business. But nobody, even when Eric Bischoff came in, it was smoke and mirrors. He had carried coffee for Vern Gagne and talked his way into a job at WCW, and he could sell himself. That I give him credit for. He's super at that, and he enjoyed some success. But there was a cost factor because he wasn't spending his money. He just had an open checkbook, and for a while had enough success that nobody questioned it. And even if they did question it and looked over his shoulder, they didn't know what they were looking at anyway. And eventually, Vince McMahon, basically, and I'm not saying that Vince didn't lose some sleepless nights when, they were losing in the ratings for some weeks, but during that period of time, WCW was not successful in pay-per-view. They couldn't run live events profitably, and Vince pioneered licensing and merchandising as a viable source of income for talent, which didn't exist at WCW. They tried to get it started, and it never went anywhere. So when you stand back arm's length and look at the big picture, Vince just had to ride it out long enough. And I mean, the production budget with what WCW was spending, it grew leaps and bounds. And all of a sudden, when the company was looking at a loss of the numbers that I heard were like $80 million projected, and somebody said, well, we've got to cut. And because Eric Bischoff had given out all these high dollar guaranteed contracts, when they cut all lower level guys is where they could cut, they were still looking at a $60 million loss and another projected $60 million loss. And when you have partners like AOL, Time Warner, they just say, hey, it's just another division. We don't need to be in the wrestling business. And we're successful at doing other things, and they pulled the plug, and WCW ceased to exist. And it was a sad day, sad for wrestling, and sad in particular for Ted Turner, because he no longer had the power to stop it, and it was a shame for someone that loved the business as much as Ted did.
Having worked so closely with Ric Flair for so many years, you likely know him probably as well as anyone, and you know exactly what he brought to the table as a performer. He was always hugely popular with the fans in NWA and WCW, but it kind of seemed like Eric Bischoff and later on Vince Russo attempted to make a mockery of him at times and never really used him to what his true potential was. Looking back, what are your impressions of the way Flair was utilized in the latter years of WCW, and why do you feel he wasn't maybe embraced more by those who were in power?
Ignorance on their part. I'm just being brutally honest about it. And Rick is still out there, and you could take Rick into a Major League Baseball locker room. You could take him into an NFL locker room, an NBA locker room, and everybody knows the Nature Boy. When we were in Philadelphia, and Charles Barkley was with the 76ers, every time we were in Philadelphia, who was at the front row ringside? Sir Charles. And, Wade Boggs, huge wrestling fan. George Steinbrenner loved wrestling. And they named a pavilion out at the fairgrounds, the Steinbrenner Pavilion, and every time we did TV or anything in Tampa, George would be down there with his grandchildren sitting in the front row, and he loved Dusty Rhodes and he loved Bobby Heenan. And I got to talk to him and be around him, and not as close as certainly Dusty or Bobby were, but when he was still in charge and my kids were real young, I got a nice letter inviting me as his guest to come down to the old Yankee Stadium, and I took my wife and my twins down, and we had parking in the lot and an elevator up to his suite on the top floor, and here we are sitting in there with all the letters on the wall from Ty Cobb and Joe DiMaggio, and all the food being catered, and there were about 3 rows of seats overlooking the field with a glass partition on both sides, and I looked to my right, and there's Reggie Jackson and Yogi Berra sitting in those seats, and I remember my wife saying, "Oh, we should do this again." I said, "You don't understand. This is not how you. This is a once in a lifetime thing." So George Steinbrenner was a great fan too. But there are people everywhere, and Rick has something about his personality that just. I used to say that a lot of times when there's a guy like Ric Flair, that the girls would go crazy over. The guys would get jealous because their girlfriends were screaming for Rick. But the guys didn't get jealous. They just wanted to be like Rick. And that doesn't happen very often, where the guys want to be like Rick and the girls love him. And even at this stage of his life, he still enjoys life to the fullest. He's a fun guy to be around. We've been friends forever, and I love the guy. And I've often said that I think in my opinion, the secret was his work ethic. And it was true with all the Horsemen. I mean, when you're at that level, it's easy to go into Madison Square Garden with 20-some thousand people and go out there and tear the house down, when you have the ability. And it's another story to go to a town, and whether the television got preempted or whatever happened, and you go there and there's 2,000 people, not 20,000 people, and you would think the guy that's in the main event could say, "Hey, my body's hurting from this work schedule, and maybe tonight, dial it back a couple notches and take it easy." But that wasn't Ric Flair, because Ric's mentality was that there was an expectation of those 2,000 people that were there that night, that they bought a ticket coming to expect to see the same Horsemen that they saw on television and everywhere else. And Rick went out and didn't cut corners. He went out there and gave the same performance level, and I think that might have had a lot to do with our success, because the fans knew when we were there, the expectation was there that we were going to deliver, and we never let them down.
Brandon Galvin, final question.
JJ, what are your thoughts on the current state of pro wrestling, and what do you think the future holds for the industry?
That's a great question, and it's not often that I'm at a loss for an answer, and I really don't have a good answer to give you. I look at the business has changed. You see somebody like The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, and I've known him since he was a young kid. I wrestled his grandfather, Peter Maivia. I wrestled his father, Rocky Johnson, throughout Florida, throughout Texas, and in Florida in the summer months when The Rock was out of school, he would go to the towns with his dad, and he'd be out there in the ring rolling around. So I've known him forever, and when I was working in talent relations, I was there right when The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, was hired at the very same time that Mark Henry was. And I set them up in a place to live and was hands-on with them, and I didn't see him when I left shortly after that, and didn't see him until I saw him at WrestleMania in Miami. And he has never, with all his success, forgotten his roots. But it's changed the business as we know it, because here's a guy that is really a true megastar, and he can, whether it's an action movie, whether it's a tongue-in-cheek comedy, he's just got the talent that he's made that crossover to being a star, and yet he still can come back and be featured at a WrestleMania and go out there and have a match with the John Cena that tears the house down. And it's because he still has respect for his history and his grandfather and his father and his foundation of what got him to where he is today. Brock Lesnar, similar situation. I just met him in Chicago when we did the Dusty tribute. I've seen him on TV but never met him. And when you see him in person, he's every bit as intimidating as he is on the big screen. And then you see a guy like Cena that's out there every night and has accomplished great things in the business. He's a guy who's probably done more for the Make-A-Wish situation than anybody else in the history of it, and he does so not for the publicity and the fanfare. And you see a crew of guys come along, many of whom are second generation. Larry Hennig, tragically lost Kurt Hennig at a young age, but now his grandson is out there. Mike Rotundo's, a couple of his sons were there. Seeker, one of the Samoans, his son. So these are people who were around the business that, even though the business has changed and is portrayed now in a different way. I mean, when we were in small territories in weekly towns and having to go back every week, we didn't have the big population centers, and we had to be more tight and protective of the inner workings of our profession. Now it's changed. They globally go all over the world, and they do things. The athletes are bigger, stronger, and they do things in the ring that I would never have dreamed of trying during my heyday. So you have to recognize that the guys that make it to that level are unique, gifted athletes. They've invested, the WWE, a lot of money in this developmental center down in Florida and Orlando, and Dusty was a big part of that too. And he's going to be sadly missed there, because all of that knowledge, he was imparting that to these young guys that are coming along. Again, it's a talent-driven business. Always was, always will be. There is a lot of programming that has to be filled, and so you see a lot of guys, a lot of exchanges, a lot of verbal back and forth. But back in the day, there would have been more action. But with the talent roster that you have, and the other thing of the Monday Night Wars that changed everything, what we used to call the enhancement matches, where you could take a Razor Ramon or the Bushwhackers or Brutus Beefcake or the Honky Tonk Man, and bring them out and establish their entrance music and have them go in the ring and establish a signature move with a young guy who was out there just to be seen and to hope someday be where the guys were across the ring that were successful. And the Monday Night Wars changed that, because now you have to have competitive matches. And it's hard to fill several hours of TV, several nights a week with competitive matches and still be able to give them either pay-per-view or network specials, whatever you want to call it. So the jury's still out on this one, because the wrestling fans are still the ultimate judge and jury. Creative people sometimes have great ideas. They envision certain things are just surefire, and then for whatever the reason that nobody can adequately explain, something doesn't click. And yet you take a couple of young guys. Daniel Bryan is one. You physically look at him, And you think, well, he's not the typical image of what you expect Vince to put in the spotlight. He doesn't have the body like the Ultimate Warrior or Superstar Graham or, what have you. And yet there's that quote unquote it factor. And Roddy Piper had it because he was not a physical monster. And the thing is, for just to get the right chemistry and get the right thing that the people and you have to. I still think you still have to listen to the people because they will tell you ultimately what they want to see, and I think only time will tell. But Vince didn't get successful this far by not being able to listen to the people around him, even though he's very strong-willed and is the ultimate decision maker. Hey, he's been right a lot more than he's been wrong.
Well, a huge thanks to our guest and wrestling legend J.J. Dillon. Tell the fans where they can support you, man.
I have a website, www.jjdillon.com. Not hard to remember, jjdillon.com, and I have a lot of pictures from very early, pictures from my induction into the WWE Hall of Fame in Miami. There is a Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame up in Amsterdam, New York, that I'm on the board, and I was inducted there the year following Miami, and it's a very special place. They have a museum up there, brick and mortar, the only brick and mortar museum in existence at this particular time, and it's not tied to, it's a nonprofit, not tied to any federation or, and there's pictures and posters and memorabilia that's been donated, and they have their induction once a year. I think this has been the 15th year, and I'm also active with the Cauliflower Alley Club, and I've been going for 10 years now since I became a lifetime member, and they've been meeting each year, usually in April, out in Vegas. And so between Cauliflower Alley Club and the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, every now and then I get a call to go to one of these fan fests. Greg Price did a series of them in Charlotte that were highly successful, and my autobiography was published in 2005, which was very critically acclaimed and something I'm very proud of. Never sold in bookstores, but the original printing of the hardbound book, which was only 3,000 copies, sold out. And I went on Amazon.com the other day just by accident, and there's actually copies on sale for as high as $800 for an original hardbound copy. Not that somebody's going to shell out $800, but I guess that that makes us, a lot of them were in the 200s and above. So if you were lucky enough to get one of the original copies, hold on to it. I think it's going to go up in value, but it's since been put out in a softcover reprint, and it's the same material. It's my whole life story. It's kind of an explanation of how the wrestling business operated through the territory days and the impact of cable television, how that changed everything, and I go into pretty good detail about the 8 years that I spent with Vince McMahon. And even if you're not a wrestling fan, it's a feel-good story about a teenager, 16-year-old kid from Trenton, New Jersey, that went to his first live wrestling match and decided that's what he wanted to do. And I live in the greatest country in the world and was able to live my dream. And I always conclude every interview by thanking the fans because I was never the biggest or the best. I loved it. I went through good times and bad times. I had a lot of help from a lot of wonderful people along the way. And then there's the one factor that sometimes is just pure luck. And I happened to be lucky enough to be the right place at the right time when the Horsemen were formed. And again, I thank the fans, because without them there would be no J.J. Dillon, there'd be no Four Horsemen, there'd be no professional wrestling.
Another huge thanks to J.J. Dillon. We appreciate your time, sir.
All right, thank you guys. And I always enjoy talking wrestling. and I hope those that follow this enjoyed the conversation and maybe learned a little something.